The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia now comes in an even more concentrated formula, with 450 milligrams of cocoflavanols, 5 times more than the leading dark chocolate bar and 15 times more than the leading cocoa powder.
CocoVia has a proprietary process that preserves cocoflavanols at the highest levels, and the product undergoes rigorous testing at every stage, which allows them to guarantee the highest level of cocoflavanols per serving and to provide the purest, highest quality product possible.
People's Pharmacy listeners can now try CocoVia for 25% off by using the code Peoples25 at cocavia.com. That's COCOAVIA.com. For decades, studies of psychedelic drugs such as LSD or psilocybin were frowned upon. Now there's a resurgence in research. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Psychedelics got a bad reputation during the 1960s and 70s. They were perceived as drugs of abuse. Legitimate research was nearly impossible. Now, researchers are re-examining how these compounds might be used to help people quit smoking and overcome a variety of other addictions.
People diagnosed with life-threatening cancers often experience crippling anxiety and depression. Can a single psychedelic session with a trained therapist help them face their existential crises?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the healing potential of psychedelic drugs. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Psychedelic drugs are associated with hippies in the 1960s. Dr. Timothy Leary urged people to turn on, tune in, drop out. But where did drugs like LSD come from?
Our guests for this part of the show understand the history of hallucinogens better than most. They're also well-versed in the medicinal chemistry of these fascinating compounds.
To learn more about the history of psychedelic drugs and the new research surrounding such compounds, we turn to Dr. David Nichols. He's an adjunct professor at the Eshelman School of Pharmacy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's an international authority on hallucinogens. Before his retirement, he had an active research program at Purdue University for 38 years. Dr. Charles Nichols is professor of pharmacology at Louisiana State University Health Sciences Center in New Orleans.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Dave Nichols.
Happy to be here.
And to you too, Dr. Charles Nichols.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Dr. Dave Nichols, you have been involved in psychedelic research and medicinal chemistry for a long time, early on.
Yes.
How did you get interested?
Well, when I went to graduate school in 1969, I actually worked on the chemistry of mescaline analogs. So I've been doing this work since 1969. And people say, well, how'd you get interested? That was in the 1960s. I actually lived at home. My parents didn't have any money, so I lived at home and worked my way through school. And a lot of my friends went away to universities, and they'd come back talking about marijuana and reefer and bennies and acid. And I got really concerned, and they were laughing at me like, you don't know what you're talking about. So I went to a used bookstore, and I bought a book, Solomons Manual of Pharmacology. And I started reading about cannabis especially, which they were smoking a lot of. And when I read it, I realized that what we had been told by public health officials was just simply incorrect. So then I began to question everything that people were saying about these kinds of drugs. So I became a sort of self-taught expert for the students and colleagues of mine that I would interact with. So I became kind of well, ask Dave. He knows. He'll tell you. And I would get these pharmacology books and basically sort of school myself. So I just thought it'd be interesting to go become an expert in these kinds of drugs because they were very popular at that time.
The chemistry is quite fascinating. Tell us a little bit about how LSD was discovered, Dr. Hoffmann and his famous bicycle ride, And then what kind of chemistry you were involved with in university?
So Albert Hoffmann was working with ergot derivatives, and the chemistry was very difficult. When he first started working in the field, his research director told him, he said, you've been a good chemist with other things, but ergots are really sensitive. So the chemistry, you're going to have to be very careful, and they're very expensive. We can't give you a lot, so you need to have really good techniques so you don't waste material, etc. So he was making a series of compounds that potentially would be useful for treating various types of cardiovascular diseases.
Now, he was working at Hoffmann-La Roche in Switzerland?
Yeah, in Sandoz, in Basel, Switzerland.
In Basel, Switzerland.
And so he had made a series of these compounds. I don't know how many he actually made, maybe 80 or so. And LSD-25, it was a particular derivative of ergot, lysergic acid diethylamide, which is LSD. He had made that in 1938, sent it down to the pharmacology department, and they had reported back that it didn't have any interesting properties. None of the compounds seemed interesting. So he was eating lunch in 1943, and he even he remembers what he was eating. Was it like cucumber sandwich with mayonnaise or whatever? And he said, I just had this feeling that they had missed something with the pharmacology of the 25th in the series. Now, why that one? I don't know. But he just felt there was some intuition that they had missed something important with this compound. So he decided to resynthesize a sample. And if you ever worked in the drug industry, once you made a compound and they tested it and said it wasn't interesting, you would have insulted the pharmacologist because he was a natural products chemist. You would have insulted the pharmacologist if you went back and said, I think you missed something on this compound. There's something here you missed. So he made another sample. He's going to send it down to pharmacology. And then on a Friday in April 16th, 1943, he had this weird kind of intoxication that was very unusual. And he went home and thought, what was I working with? It had to be this LSD. And so he came back on Monday and made up a solution and ingested what would be 250 micrograms.
Yikes, that's a big dose.
It's a pretty hefty dose, yeah. Standard clinical doses were around 100 micrograms, a tenth of a milligram. So he took a quarter of a milligram, and that was when the famous bicycle ride happened, when his laboratory assistant followed him home. He felt like he was bicycling very slowly, but his assistant said, no, you were going at a pretty good clip. Got home, they sent for the doctor because he didn't know what was happening. He thought maybe he'd been poisoned and was going to die. But the doctor came and checked his vitals, and no problem with the physiology, but just this weird intoxication, which he then kind of fell into a reverie and saw all kinds of colored visions and kaleidoscopic things. And so that was the first administration, the first detection. So then he went back to his supervisors and said, hey, listen, I took a quarter of a milligram of this stuff, and it produced this unbelievable effect. At that time, there was no drug that had any effect with that kind of potency. So they kind of poo-pooed it. And they said, well, you got to try it. So they came back, and the research director and a couple other people took 80 micrograms, which was much less, about a third of what he'd taken. And they confirmed that, indeed, this was a very interesting compound.
So, Dr. Dave Nichols, what was the environment like for that period of time when you were starting to develop interesting compounds and testing them in vitro, that is to say, in the test tube? What were clinical researchers facing at that point?
Clinical research was effectively shut down in 1976. The last study was shut down in 1976. So no one was interested in doing clinical research. There was no money for it. So even if you were a clinician that was very interested in the effects of LSD, you would have had to go through a whole barrage of paperwork, and the DEA would have been on your back. What do you need this for? How much do you need? Why are you doing this? What's your potential outcome? So it would have been very difficult after about 1970. The last study was, I think, at Johns Hopkins. It ran until 1976. They had previous approval. And then when their supply was all gone, that was the end of the clinical research.
Dr. Dave Nichols, you've described how essentially psychedelic research, at least in human subjects, was basically shut down in the 1970s. It's starting to pick back up again. What has happened? How did we get from there to here?
Well, a couple of things have happened. So there was a change in administration at the FDA that said, okay, we can't approve these. Then I was able to make the substances to enable the early studies. And then I started the Hefter Research Institute with some friends of mine that started getting money from philanthropists because we couldn't get institutional money. And so that started a lot of the psilocybin research.
So now I would say it's almost okay. It's almost legitimate to do clinical research in psychedelics. There are a number of organizations around the country, a number of academic institutions that are facilitating this kind of research. It's an exciting time because it's almost as if we're reinventing the process. What are we learning? What are some of the most exciting advances that you've seen through the institute that you helped found on the clinical side?
Well, it really is very exciting because if you look at drug companies, they've all gotten out of developing central CNS drugs because they're no good antipsychotics. The antidepressants all work the same way, if they work at all. So there's a dearth of treatments for mental illnesses of all kinds. So what we found is that a single treatment of psilocybin coupled with psychotherapy can alleviate existential depression in patients who have a cancer diagnosis, can eliminate anxiety. This is after a single treatment. We can increase sobriety in people with alcohol use disorder. We can cause people who are addicted to nicotine, to cigarettes, who have made 4 attempts to quit smoking and failed. They will stop. 80% of them have quit after a treatment like this. We've got a study of psilocybin-assisted therapy for cocaine addicts at University of Alabama. They haven't broken the blind, but that looks very promising. We're starting a study with obsessive-compulsive disorder. We're looking at studies of AIDS survivors in San Francisco that are just traumatized by the fact that they had AIDS. They've recovered. So there are a whole lot of studies, and everything we've looked at, depression, anxiety, various kinds of addictions, a lot of these disorders that are just intractable. There's no drug out there. And when you give them psilocybin with therapy 1 or 2 times, you see this amazing change. So it's a kind of therapy that's, I think, is going to revolutionize psychiatry for CNS disorders.
Now, Dr. Charles Nichols, you've been watching your dad's research for decades. And now here you're involved in it as well, but taking a slightly different path. What are you hearing from your colleagues? Because for a long time, doing this kind of research was like, a little shady. But now it's starting to be kind of exciting. So are people interested in what you're doing? Or are they kind of going, what are you up to, Charles?
Definitely interested. When I first got into the field in the mid-'90s, my father counseled me, if you go into the field of psychedelic research, that's a kiss of death for your career. And there weren't really many people studying that. And you would tell people, I work on hallucinogens and LSD, and they would roll their eyes and go, oh, that's dangerous. But now when I'm having conversations with people, they don't sort of withdraw. Oh, interesting. I've read about that, or tell me more. So there's a lot more public acceptance now. And I think really within the last 5 to 7 years, there's been some sort of watershed shift in public opinion to where it's now recognized as a potential therapy.
Dr. Dave Nichols, how do you see the future for research on psychedelic compounds?
I think if things continue in this trajectory, it will be a paradigm shift, an amazing paradigm shift for psychiatry. We have millions of people that suffer from depression, anxiety, and addictions who cannot be helped now. So the best case scenario is we suddenly have therapeutics that will allow us to treat not just the symptoms, but get rid of the basic disease state itself. And that's, you can't even, there's no way you can estimate how important that'll be. It will be a fundamental change in the way we treat mental illness.
Dr. Dave Nichols, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks also to you, Dr. Charles Nichols.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Charles Nichols, professor of pharmacology at LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans. You also heard from his father, Dr. David Nichols. Dr. Dave Nichols retired from Purdue University after 38 years and now is an adjunct professor at the Eshelman School of Pharmacy at UNC in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
After the break, we'll talk with a scientist whose research was recently profiled on the show 60 Minutes. You'll learn about research on cancer patients and how an intense psychedelic session can change a person's whole outlook on life.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored by Mighty Muscadine Grapeberry, king of the superfruits, 100% natural plant-based supplements, juice, snacks, and more.
The muscadine grape is a berry, providing greater health benefits than blueberries, cranberries, and the whole berry family with oxidative damage-fighting antioxidants to support cardiovascular, immune system, and joint health.
At Mighty Muscadine, full-time chemists and food scientists check all their products for quality and purity. Find out more online at mightymuscadine.com. The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. KAYA Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's KAYA Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Grayton.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Mighty Muscadine Grape Seed and Skin Products, natural supplements, juice, and snacks containing antioxidants that research indicates may support cardiovascular, immune system, and joint health. Information online at mightymuscadine.com.
And by CocoVia, the maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
Today, we're exploring the healing potential of psychedelic drugs. There's been a resurgence of research on these intriguing compounds over the last several years.
Our guest is Dr. Matthew Johnson, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Associate Director of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Matt Johnson.
Happy to be here. Hi, Terry and Joe.
Dr. Johnson, we were so excited to see you on 60 Minutes recently. That was so impressive. How did it go?
It was great. Of course, it's interesting to see an entire weekend boiled down to, 13 minutes? Of course, we knew that was going to be the case the entire time, but it was just really great to meet the whole team, including Anderson Cooper and their level of inquiry and interest in the area. I think it's indicative of what's happening out there more broadly. There's a lot of interest in this, a lot of mainstream interest in this new area.
What was the response like? Have you heard from your colleagues and other people?
Yeah, there's really been, frankly, it's been a little overwhelming with people. People interested in collaborations, people interested in a lot of people looking for, treatment, interested in research studies for treatment of this, that, or the other. Yeah, media inquiries. These are good problems to have, but there's been a lot of response. Like, a good advice is to clear your calendar if you're going to be on 60 Minutes for the next few days.
That sounds like good advice indeed. Now, as we understand it, you have had a group of private donors give $17 million to start the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research there at Johns Hopkins. And you are the Associate Center Director. So I hope that you are going to tell us about your new center and what projects you're especially working on.
Sure, I would love to. So it's the first ever formal center in the United States, and that has a special, specific meaning in the academic university community. It's a substantial level of financial investment. So it's the first center in the United States and the largest in the world, to our knowledge, focused on psychedelic research. So one thing that it does is something we've needed for a long time is provided some really solid support for our team. Paying at a place like Hopkins, the faculty pay for their salaries through grants and contracts, and so this brings 5 years of stability that's paying a large portion of the salary for the faculty members involved. It allows us to, and also a number of other staff members, and it allows us to expand that staff. So in addition to that, personnel infrastructure, we're able to do some limited renovations, build out some extra session rooms for conducting these therapeutic sessions, but then also, most importantly, conduct a number of new studies. So on the therapeutic side, this is all involving psilocybin as the psychedelic compound. So we're going to be doing studies using it to see if it can help treat opioid addiction and PTSD. Those are two studies that I'm the principal investigator or the lead scientist on. Then we have our colleague Fred Barrett will be conducting a study in people who have both alcoholism and depression, so the comorbidity of those two, and doing brain imaging of that, so seeing if psilocybin can help there, and if so, what's happening in the brain. We're also, my colleague Albert Garcia Romeo is going to be leading two studies, one on the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, primarily focused on the mood symptoms, but also having exploratory analyses of whether there's a benefit cognitively in terms of the decline. Also looking at post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, what some folks have called chronic Lyme disease, but looking at specifically the mood issues there. We're also, my colleague Natalie Gusakian is looking at the treatment of anorexia. And then Roland Griffiths is leading two studies in healthy normals, or people without, diagnosable problems to fix, but just looking at the effects and the potential betterment of the well. And so the two studies there are looking at the high dose effects of psilocybin on creativity, and then also looking at this phenomenon of so-called microdosing, very low doses of psilocybin, seeing what kind of effects that can have on people on a wide variety of measures. And then we also have a biomarkers core that Fred is running that runs across all of these studies, so getting the blood and various other biological assays to really ask these big questions across the studies about predictors of response, like who does this work for and who does it work for better, and what might change as a result of that treatment.
What I found so interesting in the 60 Minutes interview was one of the people who was interviewed, one of the patients, basically said, this was not fun. This was like hell. I did not enjoy this experience at all, but it worked, and it did change my behavior. I forget what it was that she was.
She was a lifelong smoker.
A smoker, and so this was a smoking cessation study with her. Do you have any idea how many people have a positive experience, how many people have a negative experience, and what might influence that one-time experience?
Yeah, so it's one thing to note is that it's not mutually exclusive. Some people have both one of the most kind of positive or meaningful experiences of their life, and they have one of the most frightening experiences of their life. So, this is a 6-hour session on average, so you can have both, and sometimes do see both. But about a third of the people will say at some point they had marked anxiety, fear, the stuff that out there in the wild folks will refer to as a bad trip. Here we really encourage people to see them as challenging experiences because in a safe environment, there's the potential to even learn from those experiences, and it's not uncommon for people to report that it was extremely difficult and I didn't like it in real time, but that they learned an incredible amount from it. And that I generally think what we're seeing there is very much like what we see in so much of psychotherapy or behavioral therapy. Like, it's hard. It's hard to go through so much of good therapy, for example, anxiety disorders and phobias, is exposing yourself in the right environment to the thing that you're afraid of, processing the memories from traumatic events, for example. So, it kind of goes into that category of, life isn't easy and no pain, no gain. I mean, of course, you can have too much, but in the right therapeutic context, the thing that gets you better is not necessarily easy.
Professor Johnson, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times a little while back in which you were quoted to say, in the 1960s, they, meaning psychedelics, were on the cutting edge of neuroscience research and understanding how the brain worked. But then it got out of the lab. What happened? Have they gotten back into the lab, specifically your lab?
Yeah, so to provide a little more detail to that, they never left the lab in terms of the non-human animal laboratory, something I understand you have a background in back in the 60s. But human research, it became bureaucratically virtually impossible to do human research with psychedelics for several decades. And that was really largely a response to the association of psychedelics with their recreational use, their association with the counterculture. So it became really politically not feasible to continue research in humans with these drugs.
And how has that changed?
So it wasn't that research was impossible or that it was explicitly banned. It was more of a case of professional marginalization.
Well, Dr. Johnson, tell us about your research. How did you get interested in psychedelics, and what have you found?
How I got interested, my interest goes back to my early days in college, where I learned about the history of human research with psychedelics and the fact that research was no longer going on. And so this included the promising findings for a number of psychiatric disorders and the idea that these were threads that were left dangling. So it was clear to me, and it was also very clear, aside from therapeutic applications, that if you're someone who's interested in the effects of psychoactive drugs as tools to understand the mind, tools to understand behavior, you're either interested in psychedelics or you don't know much about psychedelics, because they are fascinating tools. If you look at the history, you look at an indigenous use of these compounds, if you talk to enough people that have had substantial experience or even one kind of substantial experience using these compounds, folks have some pretty fascinating things to say about experiences that unfold from a single use of a compound. So it was always sort of in the back of my mind to, if I had established myself, I would pick this up in 30 to 40 years. But I was fortunately able to kind of jump on board early on in 2004 as others were getting this research up and going. So I've sort of poured myself into it. I've had to, for both pragmatic reasons, because one really can't support themselves only through doing psychedelic research, but also through interest in a broad number of other areas, many of which intersect with my interest in psychedelics. But psychedelics are a minority of my research, but they have been a substantial minority of my time is spent focusing on psychedelics. And the things that another question you asked was, what research do I have going on? So I've conducted research with my colleagues looking very carefully at healthy normals. That is research lingo for folks that don't have a nominal problem to fix. So examining the mystical type experience, which might sound a little woo-woo, but it's a validated construct from the psychology of religion. I could say some more about that, but it's a type of experience that's been reported from non-drug experiences throughout the ages, across different languages and different cultures, different religions, having some central qualities such as an overwhelming sense of unity, a sense of transcending time and space. Psychedelics. So I've conducted some research with colleagues, picking up on older research in the 60s, really showing that these compounds can fairly reliably occasion those types of experiences, which are not always, but often referred to in spiritual and or religious terms. And so we've done some subsequent research moving on to meditation with novice meditators, experienced meditators, are doing some research now with religious professionals, seeing what religious professionals say about these types of experiences and looking at what effects it might have in their profession. And then so along therapeutic lines, we've conducted it was the largest study using psilocybin to examine cancer patients who have substantial depression and or anxiety associated with their cancer. We saw substantial improvements long-term, 6 months down the road, substantial reductions in depression and anxiety from a single high-dose experience. And similar to that, we're earlier stage research. We're doing some pilot work right now with depression outside of cancer. And then there's this line of smoking cessation research. This is picking up on the older research using LSD in addiction. That was largely in treatment of alcoholism, but there was also a study with heroin addiction that looked promising. And if you look at the indigenous cultures, there's all kinds of case reports of addiction recovery. So there seems to be this kind of suggestion that these compounds could have broad applicability, not specific to one form of drug addiction or another. So given that, we decided to look at cigarette smoking, which is something that I had experience researching, tobacco and nicotine. So we've had some really good initial success there in an open-label pilot study with very high success rates, biologically confirmed 80% in our small sample, confirmed abstinent at 6 months, about 60% at 2.5 years after their target quit date. So we followed that up with a randomized trial comparing it to nicotine patch. And that we've got a few other studies around the edges, and have done survey work looking at potentially positive and negative effects out there in the population when people use these things in the wild, so to speak. But that's kind of a quick trip around the world.
I think that what has captured the imagination of a lot of people is the concept that when people are diagnosed with cancer, it's really scary. And they often have a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and sometimes some pretty severe depression. Can you summarize very briefly what some of that research has revealed?
So, as I said, substantial reductions in depression and anxiety have been observed from a single high dose. The other major finding is that, consistent with multiple lines of evidence from our laboratory, those long-term clinical improvements were not just predicted by getting the psilocybin dose, nor were they simply predicted by having a strong drug effect. They were more specifically related to having had this mystical type experience unfold after the session. So that sort of highlights this idea that what we're really looking at is a medication-facilitated therapeutic process. It's not just about some simple interaction at a receptor level, even though clearly pharmacology is involved in instigating this experience. The improvements are very much related to what that experience is, not just having psilocybin.
You're listening to Dr. Matthew Johnson, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Associate Director of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine.
Dr. Johnson referred to the research experience I went through in 1968 and 1969 at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute under Dr. Carl Pfeiffer. We were working with drugs like LSD and psilocybin. After the break, we'll find out what the future holds for psychedelic research.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This People's Pharmacy podcast is brought to you in part by Verizana.com.
Verizana Lab offers home health tests that allow you to monitor your hormones and health conditions. You can take control of the quantitative assessment of your health and learn about male and female hormone balance, the stress hormone cortisol, leaky gut, gluten intolerance, or your gut microbiome.
Take a more active role in tracking your health and take 20% off your first order of a mail-in testing opportunity with the discount code PEOPLE. That's PEOPLE, all uppercase. To learn more, go to Verizana.com. That's VERISANA.com.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored by Mighty Muscadine Grapeberry, king of the superfruits, 100% natural plant-based supplements, juice, snacks, and more.
The muscadine grape is a berry, providing greater health benefits than blueberries, cranberries, and the whole berry family with oxidative damage-fighting antioxidants to support cardiovascular, immune system, and joint health.
At Mighty Muscadine, full-time chemists and food scientists check all their products for quality and purity. Find out more online at mightymuscadine.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocoa Via, offering plant-based nutrients in the form of cocoa flavanols for brain and heart health. Online at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. KAYA Biotics.com.
And by Mighty Muscadine grapeseed and skin products, natural supplements, juice, and snacks containing antioxidants that research indicates may support cardiovascular, immune system, and joint health. Information online, mightymuscadine.com.
We're talking today about the therapeutic potential for psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin. Is there a role for such compounds in modern medicine?
Our guest is Dr. Matthew Johnson, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Associate Director of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine.
We've heard that there may be some application of psychedelics for what we'll call the existential crisis of death. As people approach the end of their lives, it can be a very scary situation. Is there any data to suggest that might be an opportunity?
Yeah, so our cancer research was really based on earlier research with LSD with people that were explicitly at end of life, who had a terminal diagnosis. In our study, we were open to both people who were not explicitly terminal and people who were. So we did have a subset of people who we didn't think would likely make it to our follow-ups, and in fact that was the case with several people, unfortunately. So I think it's we got a very good response. In fact, the people that are at that more explicit end at the terminal end of things, and often you don't know, and that's part of the insidious nature. You don't know whether one is terminal or not. But yeah, it seems like the people that are clearly going to die, it's just a matter of when. Well, that's all of us to some degree, but are clearly going to die within months, not decades, that those people are really ripe for being helped by psilocybin. I mean, all of those issues that they're dealing with seem to be brought to the fore with a good psychedelic therapy session. And so that opens up another question, like this is probably not special to cancer, so what about other terminal illnesses? And then if you kind of blow out even further, it's like, well, we all are dying, and existential distress shows up outside of any nominal serious illness. So yeah, all needs to be tested carefully, but it's exciting.
Dr. Johnson, I think it's intriguing to imagine that a compound could occasion a mystical experience. Does that one-time experience have lasting effects?
Yeah, we've seen that one-time experience have lasting effects in a number of domains.
And you have mentioned a few times, as you've described psychedelic compounds, that these are mostly derived from plants, I think. These are compounds that indigenous peoples have used. Can you tell us a little bit more about how indigenous people use the various compounds you've looked at?
Evidence suggests that psychedelics, including psilocybin, have been used for hundreds and thousands of years. The earliest evidence goes back to cave paintings in northern Africa dated to about 10,000 years ago, so before human civilization. Probably the most important thing to know that there's an overwhelming tendency for indigenous societies to use these sacramentally to control their use and not to use them as drugs of recreation.
Moving on from indigenous peoples to modern civilization, as you do research on particularly psilocybin, how do you envision the therapeutic use of these compounds?
So the therapeutic use, if these are approved in medicine outside of research, then my advice is that they be approved for use in context very similar to the way we have conducted research. So it would resemble more of outpatient surgery than it would be the prescription of antidepressants or sleeping aids, not take two and call me in the morning, but having preparation sessions, showing up to a facility for the day, for that day-long experience, having a loved one pick one up at the end of the day so they don't drive home, much like having an endoscopy or another outpatient procedure, and then follow-up care where one's psychological functioning can be assessed.
Dr. Johnson, one of the things that's going on, as you would put it, out in the wild right now is something called microdosing. Can you explain to us what that is, why people would do it, and what you think about it?
Yeah, that's this idea that of sort of taking psychedelics and really forcing them into the standard medical model. So instead of the idea of having one overwhelming experience that might have a positive effect on one's behavior going forward without having to take it repeatedly, microdosing is a way for people to take these drugs repeatedly and they claim some ongoing benefit. So taking them more like Prozac or another SSRI. The most important thing to note is there's virtually next to no research on this, and what has been reported, what we do know scientifically, hasn't really mirrored what some of the extravagant reports have been. So it's certainly an area worthy of research. I mean, I think examining the regular use of small doses of these compounds for antidepressant effects is a legitimate area. It's a good place to look. But we don't know. Be wary of all of the claims. We don't even know, for example, that it's far overstated about, everyone in Silicon Valley is using these things and psychedelic users are doing. Most psychedelic users, they suggest if they've tried microdosing, they've tried it once or twice and said,
Well, could you explain the difference between microdosing and what dose you would use, for example, in the clinic for a one-time treatment or therapy session?
Yeah, the doses that we use in our research are very strong. In fact, we've conducted studies where both with drug-naive and with people who have had substantial experience with psychedelics, who have used hundreds of times. And those people who have used hundreds of times, oftentimes after one of these experiences say, holy cow, you guys were not kidding around. That is the strongest psychedelic that I've ever had. So we use a dose, frankly, that is larger than most psychedelic fans would want to be on at a concert or anywhere in public. Microdosing is at the other end of the extreme, and the idea is that one takes a dose that they can sort of barely feel. It's not overtly psychedelic. There might be some detectable psychoactive effect, but more at the level of a strong cup of coffee. And so in terms of what dose, it depends on the compound, what that means for dose, but you're talking about doses that may be certainly less than, we're talking about a small percentage, 5% or less of a full psychedelic dose.
And what are the claims?
The claims are varied, sort of like the claims for snake oil. You can find anything you're looking for. Antidepressant effects, creativity effects, greater productivity at work, clearer thinking, being more in the flow. All of those things are notoriously susceptible to the placebo effect, which is the reason why we really need some really cautious double-blind research to really convince me that there's something there with microdosing. There may, in fact, be. There's good reason to think there could be pharmacologically. We just don't know. Some of the claims are probably overblown.
Dr. Johnson, can you tell us about side effects, please, at the clinical dose as well as at the microdose?
So at the larger doses, the major side effects are people that are 1% to 2% of the population or so that are susceptible to psychotic disorders, that have psychosis or have a strong susceptibility. They can very likely be harmed in the long-term sense to these compounds and should not be exposed to these compounds. These compounds in anybody, even a very healthy person, especially at a high dose, can cause what's called a bad trip. We frame those as challenging experiences in the laboratory, but oftentimes people find those to be meaningful learning experiences, even if they're very difficult. But out there, and even though it is relatively rare, I don't want to overstate it, but sometimes people do get into accidents, they panic, they do something dangerous, and sometimes people die. I've got a file folder full of some these cases. So that's the bad trip, so that's always a risk. And then there's physiological effects, like they increase blood pressure and pulse. So, for example, in research, we screen out people who have a severe cardiac illness, even though controlled hypertension is okay. They cause headaches, at least psilocybin does. We've published systematic research on that. It causes headaches. Nothing that should keep it that could prevent their medical use, but that's a side effect. So those are sort of the major categories of side effects. And with microdosing, we don't know. Again, there's no research, but the biggest risk, and I've been contacted by a number of people with these stories, is that they intended to take a microdose of a psychedelic, and then lo and behold, they start, the walls start waving when they're at work, that type of thing. And like, whoa, whoops. Either they're more sensitive or they mismeasured or whatever. They start having a full-blown psychedelic effect when they didn't intend to.
Dr. Johnson, you mentioned addictive research. I mean, is there some hope that for people who have not done well with traditional therapy, traditional treatment programs, that psychedelics might have a role in alcoholism, not just nicotine, but maybe even things like cocaine or heroin?
Oh, yeah. In fact, my colleague Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama, Birmingham, is in the midst of a study using psilocybin to treat cocaine addiction, and at least preliminary results suggest it may be effective. It's ongoing, so can't catch your chickens before they hatch. But yeah, that's the exciting thing. Like, methamphetamine, opioids, it's a big problem. So they all need to be tested, but all of the evidence, most of addiction medication is quelling the receptor that mediates that particular drug's response, NRT or nicotine replacement for smoking, or methadone or buprenorphine for opioids. Not to dismiss those are important tools in the toolbox, but the exciting thing here is that these may be broadly applicable to behavior that's stuck in a rut. And so, cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, gambling, the non-drug addictions, so to speak, they all need to be tested. I think there's good hope that these could eventually be used for those disorders.
Dr. Johnson, why do you think there has been so much fear over the last several decades about doing research on psychedelics? It seems that a lot of neuroscientists, have shunned this area because not only is it deadly to their careers, but they just feel anxious about doing that kind of work.
Yeah, I think in part it's a paradigm shift. I wrote a recent editorial where I kind of framed psychedelic research in the framework that Thomas Kuhn presented in the 60s in his book on the structure of scientific revolutions. And you have cases where, Newton and Darwin, their major discoveries weren't accepted for a half century. And so there's always a resistance to something that's fundamentally different, especially if someone who's in their 60s can remember being interested in these things when they were in medical school or in graduate school, but they were told, the finger was wagged at them and told them you better stay away. So I think it's understandable, and there's a lot of things in the mix. I heard early on, that sounds interesting and maybe something there, but good luck getting funding in that. So there's those pragmatic reasons. And then there's, I think, in the mix, overstated claims. Like if you look at the so-called psychedelic community, I mean, they're just like any other broad group of humans, you're going to find some pretty wacky folks. And you'll find folks with some like far-out claims that just don't seem well-grounded at all. So in terms of those things, I really kind of view the research and the potential medical use of these compounds the same way I distinguish the use of opioids in medicine. An older individual who broke their hip, for example, is getting morphine in the hospital because of incredible acute pain versus someone, I'm in Baltimore, so you see people nodding out on heroin all the time, just at the bus stops. Virtually the same pharmacology, but worlds of difference in terms of what's surrounding that use. So I think it's important to kind of distinguish the research or medical use from, recreational use. Sometimes, oftentimes is not damaging to people. I don't want to overstate it, but yeah, sometimes you see some stuff that's really out there and, dangerous use or claims that are wildly overstated.
Dr. Johnson, what does the future hold for psychedelic research? What will your laboratory be doing, and what do you see your colleagues doing?
I think the best way to think about these in their therapeutic effects as behavior change agents. And so that's exciting because there are a broad number. I mean, really, that's the field of psychiatry. Not every disorder, such as the psychotic disorders, as I mentioned, and maybe not a good number of the personality disorders, but so many disorders are associated with maladaptive behavior. And I really see what we know about these compounds, their ability to engender mental and behavioral plasticity. I see the need to test a large number of disorders through with these compounds. So who knows? We'll follow the data, but it could be that these are effective for eating disorders, for a broad number of anxiety disorders, for disorders of compulsion, so OCD. It could be that some of the personality disorders may be helped, but all of that needs to be looked at individually and cautiously. And then aside from any therapeutic use, I think these are incredible tools for understanding the brain and consciousness. We don't know why the serotonin 2A receptor is really in the human brain or the animal brain, and that's the primary receptor affected by these compounds. And so the continued use of research with these compounds may be a clue into that. There may be sort of this consciousness kind of gauging or filtering effect that they serve.
Dr. Matthew Johnson, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
My pleasure. Great questions. Enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to Dr. Matthew Johnson. He's Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Associate Director of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine.
We talked earlier with the father-son duo, Drs. Dave and Charles Nichols, about the history and medicinal chemistry of hallucinogens, as well as the potential for such compounds to ease anxiety and depression and help overcome addictions.
And again, Dr. Johnson referred to the research that I did back in the late 1960s at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Research Institute, the Neuropharmacology Laboratory there with Dr. Carl Pfeiffer and Dr. Leo Goldstein. We were looking at the effects of LSD, mescaline, psilocybin on rabbits' brains, trying to better understand mental illness.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1188. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can also share your thoughts about today's show. Have you ever tried a psychedelic drug? Please share your experience. Would you consider taking such compounds under medical supervision? Add your comments at the end of the post about show number 1188, or you can send us an email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verazana.com.
And by Cocoa Via, maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another episode again. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.